Number 10. The Carthaginian Tophet and the Shadow of Sacrificial Fear. Some ancient rituals became frightening because they involved pain, blood, or the visible risk of divine anger. The Carthaginian Tophet is darker because it lives at the center of one of the most disturbing possibilities in ancient religious memory, that a sacred space could become associated with offerings so severe that the surrounding society would never again be remembered without the shadow of sacrificial fear hanging over it. That is what makes the case so unsettling. The Tophet was not imagined as an ordinary temple precinct where worshippers simply gathered to pray. It became linked in later memory and modern debate alike to the possibility that the relationship between gods, community survival, and offering had crossed into a zone so morally and emotionally extreme that holiness itself began to feel terrifying, whether approached through ancient accusation, archaeological unease, or the logic of crisis religion. The atmosphere surrounding it is one of dread. What gave the Tophet its sacred force also made it frightening. In many ancient worlds, sacrifice was not merely symbolic performance. It was an exchange with the divine, a way of making visible that human beings owed gods something costly. The more dangerous the world felt, the more intense that logic could become. A community facing war, instability, or cosmic uncertainty might come to believe that ordinary offerings were not enough, that divine favor required something more severe, more irreversible, and more terrifyingly real. Once ritual enters that territory, sacredness darkens. The holy place is no longer simply where people ask for blessing. It becomes a place where they fear what blessing may demand in return. That is what makes the Tophet feel so haunting. A ritual landscape associated with sacrificial extremity changes the emotional texture of worship itself. The fire, the offering, the prayer, the act of dedication all begin to carry the question of what kind of God must be approached through fear this profound. Even if the full historical reality remains debated, the memory attached to the site is powerful because it speaks to something ancient people understood very well. The closer religion moves toward irreversible offering, the more it becomes hard to separate reverence from terror. A sacred place under that shadow does not reassure the living. It confronts them with the possibility that divine order may require a price too terrible to speak aloud without trembling. The deeper lesson is that some rituals become feared not because they are chaotic, but because they appear horribly disciplined in the face of divine demand. That is why the Carthaginian Tophet opens this list. It represents the fear that holiness can become most dangerous when a society believes survival, covenant, or sacred obligation requires an offering so grave that everyone standing near the rite must feel the weight of what is being surrendered. In that sense, the terror does not come only from the act itself. It comes from the belief behind it, the belief that gods may sometimes be closest when human fear is greatest. Number 9. The Hittite substitution rituals and the transfer of doom. Some rituals are frightening because they expose the body to pain or the mind to divine uncertainty. Hittite substitution rituals are darker because they work through a more intimate and unsettling idea. That disaster, impurity, curse, or doom can be moved from one being to another through sacred procedure. That is what makes the case so disturbing. In such rituals, danger is not merely resisted, it is redirected. Misfortune, guilt, divine anger, or ritual contamination is identified, gathered, and then symbolically transferred onto a substitute, an animal, an object, or another ritual carrier, so that the original person, king, or community may be spared. From the outside, that may sound orderly, even clever. But emotionally, it is terrifying because it treats doom not as an abstraction, but as something real enough to be handled, loaded, and sent elsewhere. What gave these rituals their sacred force also made them frightening. The logic of substitution promises relief, but it only works if everyone involved accepts that the danger truly exists and can truly attach itself to a body or vessel. That means the ritual must temporarily make the threat feel almost tangible. The curse is named, the pollution is recognized, the divine anger is not dismissed but acknowledged as active. Only then can transfer begin. A ceremony built on that logic inevitably creates fear, because for the ritual to succeed, people must believe that misfortune is near enough to move. Holiness here is not gentle. It is procedural contact with invisible catastrophe. That is what makes Hittite substitution rites feel so eerie. They transform sacred action into a kind of controlled displacement of terror. The substitute does not merely represent danger, it becomes, within ritual logic, the bearer of what everyone else is desperate to escape. That creates a psychologically intense atmosphere. The rite is holy because it offers a path out of disaster, yet it is feared because it makes disaster present in the room before it sends it away. Participants are forced to stand inside a moment where curse and salvation overlap, where one life, object, or vessel receives what another cannot safely keep. Sacred order, in this case, is achieved not by denying doom, but by carefully assigning it somewhere else. The deeper lesson is that some rituals terrify because they imply the world is full of transferable danger, and that only exact sacred action can keep that danger from settling where it will do harm. That is why the Hittite substitution rituals take this place on the list. They reveal a religious imagination in which evil, impurity, and divine threat are treated as terribly real, yet still negotiable through ritual expertise. That combination is profoundly unsettling. People obey such rites because they promise protection, but the protection only becomes meaningful after the ritual has forced everyone present to acknowledge how close doom may already be. Number 8. The Dionysian rites and the fear of losing the human self. Some rituals terrified ancient people because they involved blood, sacrifice, or visible danger. The Dionysian rites are darker because the fear they inspired reached inward, into the mind, the body, and the fragile boundary that normally keeps a human being feeling like a stable self. That is what makes the case so unsettling. Dionysian worship could be associated with ecstasy, altered states, frenzied celebration, and the temporary breaking of ordinary social restraint. From one angle, that can sound like liberation. From another, it is deeply frightening, because it suggests that holiness may arrive not through calm order, but through the loosening of the very structures that make a person feel rational, contained, and recognizably human. A sacred rite of this kind does not simply ask for reverence. It asks participants and witnesses to accept that divine force may move through excess, disorientation, and the frightening suspension of control. What gave these rites their sacred force also made them terrifying. Dionysian power was not imagined as a distant abstraction. It was something that could seize, overwhelm, intoxicate, and remake experience from within. That is why the surrounding fear was so powerful. A sacrifice may horrify the eye, but ecstatic ritual threatens the inner architecture of the person. Music, dance, intoxication, collective frenzy, and ritual abandon can create the impression that the god is no longer merely being honored from a safe distance. The god is entering the body, pressing against identity, and dissolving the line between worship and possession. In such a moment, holiness stops looking like serenity. It starts looking like exposure to a force that may strip away ordinary consciousness and leave behind something stranger. That is what makes the Dionysian rites feel so eerie. Ancient people often feared not only pain or death, but transformation that arrived too quickly and too completely. The idea that ritual ecstasy could push a person beyond ordinary inhibition, social structure, or even recognizable selfhood made these ceremonies spiritually compelling and psychologically dangerous at the same time. To outsiders, such rites could look like the collapse of human order into sacred wildness. To insiders, that very collapse might be the point, because the god was believed to reveal truths about existence that sober control could not contain. But that does not make the experience less frightening. It makes it more so because the ritual suggests that beneath civilized restraint, there are deeper forces waiting to surface. The deeper lesson is that some rituals become feared because they imply that divine contact may not preserve the self at all. It may shatter, suspend, or reconfigure it. That is why the Dionysian rites belong so high on this list. They reveal a form of sacred power that is not terrifying because it wounds the body directly, but because it threatens to undo the mind's confidence in its own boundaries. In such rites, holiness is inseparable from the possibility that to come too close to the god is to stop being fully oneself, and for many ancient observers, that was one of the most frightening religious possibilities of all. Number 7. The Shang oracle, bone rituals, and the terror of divine answers. Some rituals are frightening because they require pain, sacrifice, or acts of purification. The Shang oracle bone rituals are darker because they place fear inside the act of asking itself. That is what makes the case so disturbing. In these rites, questions about war, harvest, illness, weather, kingship, ancestors, and divine will were not left in silence. They were formally presented to the unseen world, and the answer was sought through a sacred procedure that treated uncertainty as something that had to be broken open. That is a terrifying idea. Once a culture believes the divine can answer directly, the act of asking ceases to be innocent. Every question becomes a risk, because the answer may confirm danger, demand action, or reveal that forces beyond human control are already shaping the future. What gave the oracle bone rituals their sacred force also made them frightening. Divination is not merely curiosity. It is structured exposure to the possibility that the world has intentions hidden inside it. In the Shang context, the king and ritual specialists were not simply wondering what might happen. They were submitting uncertainty to a system in which ancestors and divine powers could respond. The cracking bone, the inscription, the interpretation, and the later verification all made the process feel grave and binding. The ritual did not comfort people by eliminating mystery. It made mystery speak. And once mystery speaks, fear changes shape. It is no longer the fear of not knowing. It becomes the fear of having received an answer that now cannot be ignored. That is what makes these rituals feel so haunting. A divine answer is not always reassuring. It may predict misfortune. It may expose disfavor. It may demand costly action. It may reveal that a campaign should proceed, that a sacrifice is necessary, that an illness carries spiritual weight, or that a ruler's judgment must now align with what has been ritually disclosed. The ceremony therefore becomes emotionally intense long before the result is known. Everyone involved understands that the unseen world is being formally consulted, and that once the reply is interpreted, the community cannot pretend the question was never asked. Sacred knowledge enters decision-making like a pressure no ordinary politics can safely dismiss. The deeper lesson is that some rituals terrify because they turn divine communication into obligation. That is why the Shang oracle bone rituals take this place on the list. They show how holiness can become frightening when it offers not vague inspiration, but concrete answers that bind rulers and communities to the dangerous responsibility of response. In such rites, the sacred is not merely worshipped. It is interrogated, and that interrogation is terrifying because everyone knows the true danger may begin the moment the ancestors reply. Number 6. The Greek pharmakos and the violence of sacred purification. Some rituals frightened people because they involved sacrifice, prophecy, or ecstatic loss of control. The pharmakos is darker because it placed fear inside the very idea of purification itself. That is what makes the case so unsettling. In theory, purification sounds holy, necessary, and even protective. A community burdened by pollution, crisis, famine, plague, or divine anger seeks a way to cleanse itself and restore balance. But the pharmakos reveals how terrifying that logic can become when purification demands that one human being be marked out as the carrier of the community's danger. At that point, ritual does not merely remove evil in the abstract. It gives evil a body, a face, and a target. What gave the pharmakos its sacred force also made it frightening. The rite worked only if people believed pollution was real, communal disorder was spiritually dangerous, and sacred removal could push that danger away. That meant the chosen figure was never merely symbolic in an empty sense. The person became the vessel into which the fears of the entire city could be loaded. Crisis, blame, contamination, and divine displeasure all converged on a single body so that the rest of the community could imagine itself restored. This is where the ritual becomes psychologically brutal. Purification no longer appears gentle or inward. It becomes social violence wrapped in sacred necessity, a moment when holiness seems to require exclusion, humiliation, and the expulsion of living fear. That is what makes the pharmakos feel so eerie. It exposes one of the darkest truths in ritual history. Communities often feel most united when they believe danger has been successfully transferred elsewhere. The crowd can experience relief, but that relief is inseparable from the fate of the one who carries away what everyone else dreads. In such a ceremony, sacred order is not recovered through prayer alone. It is recovered by casting something out, by dramatizing the removal of corruption so intensely that the entire society can watch fear being pushed beyond its boundaries. The ritual may promise renewal, yet the path to renewal is saturated with cruelty. That is why it remains so disturbing. It suggests that holiness, under pressure, may demand not simply worship, but an embodied victim of disorder. The deeper lesson is that some rituals terrify, because they make cleansing itself look violent. That is why the Greek pharmakos belongs on this list. It reveals a religious imagination in which sacred purification could become emotionally and socially severe, forcing a community to confront its fear of pollution by turning one human life into the boundary between danger and restored order. In such a rite, the holy is not soft or comforting. It is a force that reorganizes fear by assigning it a bearer, and once a culture accepts that logic, purification begins to look almost as frightening as the disorder it was meant to cure. Number 5. The Babylonian Akitu and the dangerous humbling of the king. Some rituals were feared because they involved blood, death, or ecstatic disorientation. The Babylonian Akitu is darker because its terror lay in something more politically and spiritually precarious: the public humiliation of the king before divine authority. That is what makes the case so unsettling. New Year festivals are often imagined as celebrations of renewal, order, and cosmic continuity, and Akitu certainly carried those meanings. But within that sacred cycle stood a dangerous moment in which royal status itself was exposed, tested, and symbolically stripped down before the gods. A society that ties cosmic stability to kingship is already living under immense sacred pressure. Once that same society ritually humiliates the king in order to renew legitimacy, the ceremony becomes both holy and unnerving because it reveals how fragile the throne really is before divine judgment. What gave Akitu its sacred force also made it frightening. The rite was not simply pageantry. It dramatized the truth that kingship, no matter how magnificent in public life, remained subordinate to cosmic and divine order. The king had to submit. His power had to be symbolically reduced, examined, and restored under sacred conditions. That creates a deep emotional tension. On one hand, the ritual protects the kingdom by reaffirming that the ruler governs only with divine sanction. On the other hand, it publicly stages the possibility that sanction can be questioned, withdrawn, or made uncertain. The whole community is forced to witness the fact that royal dignity is not absolute. It depends on surviving a sacred encounter in which the gods stand above the throne. That is what makes the Akitu feel so heavy. A king's humiliation is never just personal in this context. It is political, cosmic, and communal all at once. If the ritual succeeds, order is renewed. If the symbolism cuts too deeply, it reveals how close the kingdom always lives to instability. The rite therefore becomes a controlled crisis, a sacred drama in which the ruler must be lowered so that the world may continue. But that lowering is not emotionally safe. It invites everyone watching to recognize that the most powerful human being in the land can be reduced, corrected, and symbolically broken before the divine. The result is a ceremony in which renewal depends on passing through danger, because legitimacy itself must be re-earned under the shadow of possible divine rejection. The deeper lesson is that some rituals terrify because they reveal that sacred order does not flatter power. It judges it. That is why the Babylonian Akitu takes this place on the list. It shows how a rite can look magnificent from the outside while carrying an inner atmosphere of real dread, because the renewal of the cosmos is tied to the temporary undoing of the king. In such a moment, holiness is inseparable from exposure. The crown remains, the city celebrates, the gods are honored, but everyone present is reminded that kingship survives only by passing through a sacred humiliation severe enough to prove that even the ruler stands trembling before powers higher than himself. Number 4. The Spartan rite at Artemis Orthia and ritualized pain. Some rituals frightened ancient people because they dealt with death, divine anger, or the danger of hidden judgment. The Spartan rite at Artemis Orthia is darker because it made pain itself part of what looked holy. That is what makes the case so unsettling. At first glance, a civic religious ceremony honoring a goddess might seem like something orderly, disciplined, even admirable within the severe culture of Sparta. But this rite became bound to the spectacle of endurance under suffering, to the public testing of bodies before a sacred audience, and to the idea that holiness could demand not calm devotion, but visible submission through pain. Once a ritual crosses into that territory, the fear around it becomes immediate. People are no longer only afraid of what the gods might think. They are afraid of what the sacred order is prepared to do to the human body in order to prove discipline, loyalty, and worth. What gave the rite its sacred force also made it frightening. Sparta was a society that treated hardness, control, and endurance as essential virtues, and when such values are absorbed into ritual, the ceremony becomes more than worship. It becomes a demonstration that pain can be morally and spiritually meaningful when placed under divine sanction. That is a terrifying message, because it teaches the surrounding community that suffering is not merely tolerated. It is formalized. It is witnessed. It is woven into the sacred fabric of civic life. The body under strain becomes a public offering of obedience, and the line between religious devotion and ritualized violence grows dangerously thin. In such a setting, spectators do not simply observe a ceremony. They confront a vision of holiness that tests human flesh, as if the gods themselves demand proof through wounds. That is what makes the Spartan rite feel so eerie. Pain in ordinary life may be accidental, tragic, or shameful, but pain inside ritual becomes something else entirely. It is organized, expected, and interpreted as spiritually significant. That changes its emotional power. The young person undergoing the ordeal is no longer just suffering. He is being measured within a sacred framework that binds the goddess, the city, and the ideal of endurance into one terrifying performance. The crowd may admire the act, but admiration does not cancel fear. It deepens it, because everyone present understands that this is what their society considers holy enough to preserve. A ritual like this does not merely honor divine power. It declares that sacred order is compatible with inflicted suffering, provided that suffering serves a higher discipline. The deeper lesson is that some rituals terrify because they sanctify endurance to such an extent that pain itself becomes an instrument of holiness. That is why the rite at Artemis Orthia belongs so high on this list. It reveals a world in which the sacred is not soft, healing, or protective in the ordinary sense, but stern, demanding, and willing to use bodily ordeal as proof of value. In that kind of ceremony, fear comes not only from the gods above, but from the realization that the community below has agreed to treat suffering as a legitimate path towards sacred legitimacy. Number 3. The Egyptian opening of the mouth and the fear of returning presence. Some rituals are frightening because they involve blood, punishment, or violent purification. The opening of the mouth is darker because it reaches into one of the oldest and most disturbing anxieties in human religion, the fear that death may not be a complete separation, and that ritual can reopen the boundary between the dead and the living. That is what makes the case so unsettling. On the surface, the rite was solemn, controlled, and deeply sacred, meant to restore the senses and capacities of the deceased so that they could live, breathe, speak, and receive offerings in the next world. But precisely because of that purpose, the ceremony carries an unnerving emotional charge. It is not content to honor the dead from a safe distance. It acts as though ritual can reawaken presence, making the deceased spiritually operative again. That is a holy idea, but it is also terrifying, because it suggests that death itself is not as sealed as it appears. What gave the rite its sacred force also made it frightening. Ancient Egyptian religion treated the afterlife with extraordinary seriousness, and royal and elite funerary ritual was built on the conviction that proper ceremonies could sustain, empower, and transform the dead beyond the tomb. The opening of the mouth, therefore, did not merely symbolize remembrance. It performed restoration. The mouth, eyes, ears, and senses of the deceased were ritually reactivated so that the person could once again participate in a sacred mode of existence. For those standing near such a ceremony, the emotional power must have been immense. The body was still a body, the tomb was still a tomb. Yet the ritual insisted that through sacred action, the dead could once more receive offerings, speak in a spiritual sense, and continue as a real presence in the cosmic order. That is where fear enters. The ceremony treats absence as something ritual can challenge. That is what makes the opening of the mouth feel so haunting. It does not resemble horror in the crude sense. Its dread is more refined and more ancient than that. It lies in the controlled seriousness with which a society approaches the dead as still recoverable to sacred presence. The rite asks participants to stand inside a moment where the dead are neither simply gone nor simply alive, but undergoing ceremonial reactivation through exact sacred procedure. Such a moment is powerful precisely because it destabilizes ordinary emotional categories. Grief, reverence, hope, obligation, and fear all meet in the same act. The dead are being honored, but they are also being made active again in ritual terms, and any culture that believes such restoration is possible will naturally feel the weight of standing too near it. The deeper lesson is that some rituals terrify because they suggest sacred power can reopen what human beings most need to believe is closed. That is why the opening of the mouth takes this place near the top of the list. It reveals a form of holiness inseparable from the fear of returning presence, from the suspicion that the dead may remain close, responsive, and dependent on exact ritual care. In such a ceremony, the sacred does not merely comfort mourners, it confronts them with the possibility that death is porous under divine order, and that through ritual the boundary between this world and the next can become frighteningly thin. Number 2. The Aztec New Fire Ceremony at the edge of cosmic panic. Some rituals frightened ancient people because they involved sacrifice, suffering, or the visible risk of divine anger. The Aztec New Fire Ceremony is darker because it placed an entire civilization inside the fear that the cosmos itself might fail if the rite did not succeed. That is what makes the case so unsettling. This was not simply a festival of renewal in the ordinary sense. It unfolded under the terrifying possibility that time could stop, that the sun might not continue, and that the world could slide into destruction if sacred order were not restored at exactly the right moment. A ritual built around that kind of fear cannot feel calm, no matter how formal or beautiful its outward structure may appear. It is holy because it confronts cosmic danger directly, and it is terrifying because everyone involved understands that the danger is not symbolic. It is total. What gave the new fire ceremony its sacred force also made it frightening. The rite was tied to cyclical time, cosmic balance, and the maintenance of the world itself. That means the ceremony did not merely ask for blessing. It stood at the threshold between continuation and catastrophe. Darkness, waiting, tension, and sacrificial action all became charged with civilizational meaning. A community may endure many rituals through habit or tradition, but a ritual performed under the belief that existence itself depends on its success becomes something far more intense. The people around it are no longer just worshippers. They are witnesses to a moment when sacred failure could mean universal ruin. Once ritual enters that territory, every gesture becomes heavy, every delay becomes ominous, every sign matters too much. That is what makes the new fire ceremony feel so haunting. It transforms religion into a controlled confrontation with annihilation. The old fires go out. The world holds its breath. Sacred action must begin again under conditions of fear so profound that the restoration of flame becomes the restoration of reality itself. That emotional structure is extraordinary. It means that holiness here is inseparable from panic held in ceremonial form. The rite offers hope, but only after forcing everyone into the shadow of the possibility that there may be no more dawn, no more order, and no more future if the cosmos is not renewed. In such a setting, ritual does not soothe anxiety first. It magnifies it until divine restoration becomes almost unbearable in significance. The deeper lesson is that some rituals terrify because they make the survival of the world feel conditional. That is why the Aztec New Fire Ceremony takes the number 2 place on this list. It reveals a sacred imagination in which cosmic continuity is never automatic, where humanity must participate in the dangerous maintenance of existence itself. People obey such a ceremony with dread because they believe the boundary between order and extinction has grown terribly thin. In that moment, the holy is not gentle, symbolic, or distant. It is the fire that must return, or the world will not. Number 1. The Roman rite of devotio and sacred self-destruction. Some rituals are frightening because they involve blood, divine judgment, or the fear of opening a path between worlds. Devotio is darker than almost any of them because it makes holiness depend on a person consciously giving himself over to death in order to unleash sacred power through his own destruction. That is what makes the case so chilling. In this Roman rite, a commander could dedicate himself and the enemy to the gods of the underworld and death, effectively transforming his own death into a ritual weapon. This is not merely sacrifice in the broad sense. It is sacred self-annihilation performed with intention, formula, and terrifying clarity. The individual does not simply risk death in battle. He enters death as part of the rite itself, making his body, his fate, and his extinction instruments of divine exchange. That is a level of sacred seriousness so extreme that it turns the battlefield into something more than war. It becomes liturgy under the shadow of the grave. What gave devotio its sacred force also made it terrifying. Roman religion could be formal, legalistic, and exact, and that exactness only deepens the dread here. The rite is not chaotic desperation. It is disciplined surrender to a sacred logic in which the destruction of the self becomes the means of securing victory, restoring favor, or altering the moral and spiritual conditions of battle. That is emotionally overwhelming because it forces everyone present to watch a human being cross from command into consecrated death. The act does not merely honor the gods. It offers a life in a way so total that the boundary between courage and ritual doom almost disappears. Once a society accepts such a possibility, holiness becomes inseparable from the knowledge that divine power may demand not just offerings, not just pain, but the deliberate forfeiture of one's own future. That is what makes devotio feel so haunting. Many rituals terrify by threatening what may happen to a victim, a king, or a symbolic substitute. Devotio is more disturbing because the person entering the rite chooses, speaks, and proceeds with full ritual awareness into a death that is meant to matter cosmically and militarily at once. It is therefore both noble and horrifying, which makes it even darker. The surrounding community is not merely watching a tragedy. It is watching sacred intention convert a human life into a final instrument of divine transaction. In that moment, religion does not stand beside violence. It passes through the willing destruction of the self and gives that destruction sacred meaning. Few things are more unsettling than a holy act that becomes most powerful at the exact point where the worshipper ceases to survive it. The deeper lesson is that some rituals terrify because they reveal the most extreme possibility in ancient religion, that sacred power may be reached not by preserving life, but by offering life completely. That is why devotio takes the #1 place on this list. It captures the darkest thread running through all these ceremonies. The idea that holiness can become most intense where fear, death, obedience, and cosmic transaction meet. In devotio, the sacred is not a refuge from destruction. It is destruction made ritual, meaningful, and binding before the gods. That is why it remains one of the most chilling rites in ancient memory. It shows that the holiest act in a desperate moment may also be the one that asks a human being to walk knowingly into death and call it sacred.